new book, The Strategist, Brent Scowcroft and the Call of National Security. And briefly, The Strategist examines the foreign policy career of former U.S. National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft. He's known for helping to mount the American departure from Vietnam, the historic breakthrough in China. He urged George H.W. Bush to repel the invasion of Kuwait, and he worked to shape the West's skillful response to the collapse of the Soviet Empire. So that's going to explain everything to us. And also there's a book sale, book signing immediately after the talk. Thank you.
When you go through the tunnel of love in Washington, you hold your own hand. This is one of the jokes Scowcroft likes to tell when he's giving a speech. Or another, a friend of Washington is someone who stabs you in the chest. These jokes no doubt reflect Scowcroft's expectation of what Americans think of Washington, but the irony is that it's no overstatement to say that Scowcroft has a great many good friends, and he is much loved not only in Washington, but also in Utah, where he's from, and elsewhere around the country and overseas. Neither is it Pollyannish to say that he gives Washington, D.C. a good name, and that a study of his life brings rightful attention to those who work for the government or in public service, but do not expect to get or seek popular recognition or acclaim. What I'd like to do today is to talk about Brent Scowcroft's highly influential but very quiet role in the history of U.S. national security policy, then say a few words about what made him unusually effective, discuss why he is a strategist of the First Order, and conclude by stepping back a bit and ask why, as a political scientist, I chose to write a biography, which is somewhat anathema for political scientists, as some of you may know. But first, I'd like to thank Professor Julian Zelzer for inviting me to the Woodrow Wilson School, to Dean Cecilia Rouse and Patricia Yalevich and others at Princeton for making this visit possible. The fact that Brent Scowcroft ended up in the White House and ultimately rose to become National Security Advisor was no accident. Scowcroft's Air Force bosses proposed that he be appointed National Security Advisor, military assistant, in order to attract the attention of then National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger and to be selected as his next deputy to replace General Alexander Haig. He did, and he was. So in early 1973, a year after becoming military assistant, and at the beginning of Richard Nixon's second term in office, Scowcroft became Kissinger's deputy. He held this role as de facto National Security Advisor after Kissinger became Secretary of State in September 1973 until November 1975, when President Ford reshuffled his cabinet and appointed Scowcroft National Security Advisor outright. Over the Nixon-Ford years, Scowcroft distinguished himself by being utterly reliable, highly competent, and very discreet. He became one of Richard Nixon's most trusted advisors, and this from someone who really didn't trust anyone, and Gerald Ford's right-hand man. Scowcroft coordinated the evacuation of Vietnam and South Vietnam, for instance, and he was at the center of policymaking, working with President Ford, Secretary of State Kissinger, Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Congress, and the President and the press. Scowcroft, the U.S. Ambassador to Vietnam, Graham Martin, and President Ford wanted to delay the evacuation as long as possible so they could evacuate as many as South Vietnamese as they could. In contrast, others in the administration, such as the press secretaries and the political advisors, the Democratic Congress, and most writers and pundits wanted to get out as soon as possible. The result was that 130,000 Vietnamese got out in April 75, 10 times the number expected by the State Department. In the final 14 hours alone, on April 29th and 30th, Marine helicopters lifted out over 8,000 military personnel, embassy officials, South Vietnamese, and their dependents. Scowcroft's relationship with Ford was much closer than his friendship with Nixon. Ford was less complicated. He didn't even plan to run for re-election in 1976 and only changed his mind when he realized he didn't want to be a 2.5-year lame duck president. And in fact, he never sought the White House in the first place. He would have been happy to continue on as House Minority Leader and perhaps House Majority Leader at some point. Scowcroft got to know Gerald Ford through a series of weekly one-on-one afternoon briefings, up to 2 hours in length, for the purpose of educating the Vice President on national security issues. These briefings began in October '73, following the resignation of Vice President Agnew, and in them, Scowcroft addressed a range of complex topics in international affairs, national security, topics that the new Vice President was only partially familiar with, since he had mostly focused on budgetary and domestic issues as a member of Congress. Scowcroft conducted these tutorials with phenomenal intensity, according to a White House witness. Rather than simply lecture the former House Minority Leader, he had the NSC staff, with the help of the CIA, draft short papers on major issues such as arms control, U.S.-Japan policy, human rights, and specific European allies. Each week, he would assign a present for Ford to read and then digest in advance of their tutorial. Scowcroft would then brief Ford on what happened that week and then lead a discussion on the issue covered in that week's paper. In this way, Ford became familiar with the context and development of national security, learned some of the ins and outs of current events, and acquired a working knowledge of the personalities and idiosyncrasies of the principal actors in foreign affairs. This informal tutoring forged a close bond between the two men, one that was reinforced once Ford became president proper, and Scowcroft began to see him 3 or 4 times a day, going into his office to hand him memos, update him on pressing issues, and when solicited, offer advice. In what was a difficult time with the presidency under siege, Scowcroft was, in the description of a national security expert who has studied the 70s at length, a rock of stability. One of the administration's few obvious triumphs, what with the Nixon pardon, the ignominious end to the Vietnam War, and a hostile Congress, came just 2 weeks after the evacuation of Saigon with a recapture of the seized U.S. ship, the Mayaguez, and the rescue of its crew. The Mayaguez, incidentally, was the first container ship ever. A little bit of trivia. It's now scrap metal and no longer exists. Scowcroft again took the role of crisis manager and coordinated the administration's 3-part response: its ground assault of the island of Koh Tang, an air attack on the Cambodian mainland, and the physical recapture of the Mayaguez, the first Marine ship-to-ship capture since Jefferson administration's war on the Barbary pirates. The Deputy National Security Committee briefed the members of the NSC. He kept the NSC meetings, and there are 4 in just 3 days, focused on what had to be decided, and he brought up vital material relevant to the matter under discussion. One example is that Scowcroft, together with Chief of Staff Donald Rumsfeld, made the important point that attack aircraft from an arriving aircraft carrier could get to the battle scene significantly faster in advance than the carrier itself, something that the Defense Secretary and the acting chairman of the Joint Chiefs neglected to mention. Scowcroft was up all night, was described as just absolutely harried and rumpled for the duration of these 3+ day crises, and capturing naps when he could. A few weeks after the Mayaguez crisis, with the entire Mayaguez crew safe and the ship back in American hands, 2 letters were placed in his personnel file. The first was from Kissinger. "Dear Brent," he wrote, "your extraordinary performance during the Mayaguez incident was no surprise to me, but it reminded me of the debt I and the President and the country owe you. You were the focal point of the effort. Your judgment and strength were a tremendous report." The other letter was signed Jerry Ford. "During the Mayaguez incident," he wrote, "your support to me was even more than your usual superb contribution. 24 hours a day, you were a pillar of strength. Your dedication and professional skill were in the highest tradition of the service of the Armed Forces of the United States. All Americans owe you a debt of gratitude." The Mayaguez incident marked the last official battle of the Vietnam War, and the names of the 3 Marines accidentally abandoned on Koh Tang and then executed by the Khmer Rouge are the final names engraved in Maya Lin's Vietnam Memorial. The United States had entered into China to save a country, Kissinger noted ironically, and ended by rescuing a ship. Scowcroft played a vital role in another critical policy arena, and this was intelligence. After Seymour Hersh broke the story of the CIA's family jewels, the Senate and House each created a committee to investigate the CIA under the chairman of Senator Frank Church and Representative Otis Pike, respectively. Meanwhile, the Ford administration set up its own Rockefeller Commission to clean up the mess. And what a mess. Among the family jewels were revelation that the CIA had wiretapped almost 10,000 citizens, kept files on 100,000 Americans, opened first-class mail, infiltrated domestic anti-war and black activist groups, and conducted psychological experiments on civilians, all actions legally prohibited. The CIA also illegally broke into and entered the premises of 2 of its former employees, placed wiretaps on 2 news columnists, and placed physical surveillance on 3 former CIA employees and 5 news reporters. The executive was again under fire. Watergate redux, it seemed. Scowcroft had no choice but to be involved, since the National Security Advisor had the formal oversight of intelligence and covert actions in his portfolio. He had to decide how to respond to Congress's request for intelligence, whether to release classified information, to redact classified documents before handing them over, or to provide paraphrased versions of the documents. He also had to handle CIA Director William Colby, who was leaking most of the evidence. Colby had apparently decided to come clean. In over a 12-month period, he made 32 trips to Capitol Hill testifying to many of the CIA's activities and agreed to hand CIA documents over to the Church Committee, even though Kissinger, Ford, Scowcroft, and the President's General Counsel hadn't yet agreed whether they should submit the documents. Bill really became a tortured soul in this period, Scowcroft said. He saw his life and his life's work crumbling. Or, as Kissinger joked, Bill, you know what you do when you go to the Hill? You go to the confession. So Scowcroft ordered a comprehensive study of the organization and management of the entire intelligence community, which addressed a number of key issues about sharing intelligence with the FBI, whether the president should have an independent intelligence advisor, and how covert proposals should be handled. He made recommendations as to how the leadership of the intelligence community should be improved, how intelligence should be consolidated, and how analysis and production should be realigned. He also discussed whether covert action should be separated from the CIA and speculated about the major reorganization options for the community. In fact, a lot of these same issues came up in 2001, just before and after September 11th. A month later, President Ford issued an executive order establishing new ground rules for intelligence. The new rules retained the National Security Council's control of intelligence, but now the National Security Advisor would be in charge. He, later a she of course, would initiate intelligence planning, conduct semi-annual policy reviews of foreign intelligence activities, and manage the foreign intelligence community. A new Special Operations Advisory Group would review and recommend covert action, and a new Intelligence Oversight Board, a 3-person subgroup of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, was to conduct general oversight of the CIA. And Scowcroft, as the National Security Advisor, was now the chair of the Special Operations Advisory Group. Scowcroft described having a bunker mentality during the Nixon-Ford years, that is the 72 to 76, given the damage done to the presidency from Vietnam, Watergate, the pardon, and the CIA scandal. But the frustrations of the Nixon-Ford years caused Scowcroft to grow as a policymaker. Later, under the first George Bush, Scowcroft would be much better at working with what was once again a Democratic-controlled Congress and a critical press. Scowcroft was also there at the opening to China and Nixon's strategic triangulation. Indeed, from the early 70s to the present, Scowcroft has been closely tied to China as a policymaker, as a business consultant, as a mediator, and as a deal maker. Indeed, he and the President succeeded in maintaining U.S.-China relations in the aftermath of Tiananmen Square massacre on June 4, 1989, fearing in Moscow Beijing rapprochement, a new bamboo curtain, or perhaps a return to the Cultural Revolution. Later, he would smooth things over following the 2001 Hainan Island incident when a U.S. Reconnaissance aircraft had a crash and was forced to land on Hainan Island. Scowcroft was never appointed to a White House position during the Reagan years, of course, but he did serve on two important committees. As the chairman of the eponymous Scowcroft Commission, he managed to overcome the impasse over how to handle the MX missile after two unsuccessful previous tries. Then, as one of three members of the Tower Board, he analyzed the operations of the National Security Council in the aftermath of the Iran-Contra scandal, and he succeeded in limiting the damage. Despite the House and Senate combined investigation and the efforts of the special prosecutor, and without a smoking gun, the Iran-Contra affair remains a long, unsavory footnote to the Reagan legacy. Things would operate much better in the first Bush administration, at least with respect to foreign policy. Scowcroft, together with the President James Baker, succeeded in overseeing the peaceful liberalization of Eastern Europe and the reunification of Germany within NATO, as you heard in the introduction. And Bush, Baker, and Scowcroft, and these were really the three principal policymakers, were able to coax and cajole the Soviet Union into its dissolution by pushing the Soviet Union as hard as they could, at the same time allowing the Soviet Union to save face and giving them economic incentives and credits and other goods, so it was never so militaristic, never so heavy-handed. So the result was that Soviet leaders never felt directly threatened by the United States or NATO. And this diplomatic strategy was arguably the result of Malta in December of 1989, the summit, and the rapport established between the two leaders and their staffs, as between Baker and Shevardnadze, as well as between President Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev. We forget that for all of Gorbachev's inspiring rhetoric and the euphoria of the late 80s, and I remember that well, and I'm sure many of you remember that even better, when Bush took office, the Soviet military's conventional nuclear weapons were all still in place. The Soviet Union was still providing material assistance to Cambodia, the Nicaraguan rebels, Angola, and Afghanistan, and Gorbachev had not yet renounced the union of the workers of the world and the overthrow of capitalism. Crucial for Bush, Baker, and Scowcroft was then the juxtaposition of negotiations over conventional nuclear weapons with economic carrots and diplomacy, so the administration could overcome the hostility of the Soviet Union, France, and United Kingdom, three of the four occupying powers in Germany, to agree to a reunited Germany within NATO. And the within NATO part is absolutely crucial because Kissinger and others had these ideas for this neutral power or an independent united Germany within Europe. In other areas, Scowcroft and the Bush administration were less successful. Afghanistan, after Soviet troops withdrew in February 1989, the Bush government simply didn't have the bandwidth or the prescience to devote more attention and effort. For too long, the Reagan and then Bush governments generously aided radical Sunnis, the Mujahideen, who would defeat the Soviets and liberate Afghanistan. Even after the Soviets decided to cut their losses, though, and withdrew, the result, this continued, and the result, as we know, was blowback. Consider, too, the fact that the Panama coup attempt in October 2nd, 1989 could have succeeded, except the White House didn't have the intelligence or the decision-making processes coordinated sufficiently. Afterwards, Scowcroft admitted to his press secretary, "We were sort of Keystone Cops." 3 months later, the administration invaded Panama and deposed Manuel Noriega. The same with Yugoslavia with Milosevic, where there was wishful thinking on the part of Scowcroft and the Deputy Secretary of State Larry Eagleburger, Lawrence of Macedonia to State Department wags, and Lawrence of Serbia to some Europeans, that they didn't think it would fail. And some say that, well, there's an element of fatigue after the reunification of Germany, after the Gulf War, after China. Nonetheless, U.S. interests were at stake, in having a Europe able to handle its own affairs, even if with some U.S. assistance and coordination, Europe able to respond effectively to regional crises, and Europe able to demonstrate the political viability of a pluralist, multicultural society, that is Yugoslavia, not unlike the United States. And showing that the NATO members could act in concert, notwithstanding the different relations NATO members had with Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia, and Kosovo. Scowcroft voiced regret over how the administration had handled Yugoslavia, wishing in hindsight that he and the administration had been more proactive with what they knew about the atrocities in Bosnia and Herzegovina. One of Scowcroft's chief legacies was his insistence that the administration get Iraqi forces to withdraw from Kuwait, and by force if need be, given that General Colin Powell, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Secretary of State Baker, and President Bush himself were all initially on the fence about invading Iraq. Scowcroft was responsible for quickly getting the president on board with his position in a conversation between the two of them immediately after the first inconclusive NSC meeting. But wholly in character, Scowcroft publicly credited Bush for his resolve. He then, that is Scowcroft, helped build the 28-country coalition, helped UN Ambassador Pickering get the UN to pass 10 resolutions in support of the eviction of Iraq from Kuwait, and ultimately succeed in having a democratic Congress grant the president the authority to use all necessary means to evict Iraq from Kuwait. But here, too, there are missteps. The Bush administration misread the signals of a pending Iraq attack on Kuwait, warnings from the CIA and satellite surveillance. Reassured by Mubarak, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan, however, where Iraq was in talks with Kuwait about oil drilling in the Rumaila oil field at the time, the president and his advisors gave Saddam Hussein the benefit of the doubt. Revealingly, neither Mossad nor the KGB predicted the attack. Interestingly, Scowcroft later famously opposed going to war against Iraq after the attacks of September 11, 2001. In a Wall Street Journal op-ed in August the following year, that is 2002, Scowcroft argued that the invasion and occupation of Iraq would be very expensive and, quote, have various serious and bloody consequences. He wrote that Saddam Hussein was first and foremost a power-hungry survivor who had little cause to join al-Qaeda, and that he could be deterred, just like other aggressors. He warned, too, that should the United States attack Iraq, the ensuing war could, quote, swell the ranks of terrorists, unquote, sidetrack U.S. foreign policy from grappling with the more important Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and possibly destabilize Arab regimes in the region. The irony being that one of Saddam's strategic objectives was precisely such destabilization. Yet in 2007, and this is actually where I begin the book, he came out in support of the surge, even though he'd been ostracized by the Bush White House after his outspoken dissent in the Wall Street Journal. And he continues to be active, Scowcroft that is. He'll be 91 next month, and since 1994 he's run his own international corporate consulting firm, probably the most highly regarded in Washington according to several people who know the business. More recently, Scowcroft advised that the United States not provide any arms for Ukraine, essentially recognizing a Russian sphere of influence that the United States could not, as a practical matter, resist through military means. And he came out in support of the recent Iran agreement in a syndicated op-ed piece, in which he argued that the deal might not be perfect, but that it would be preposterous to think the United States can rule by fiat, that it could get international agreement and induce other states to alter their preferences without making any concessions. So what made Scowcroft so extraordinarily effective, even if, to be sure, not always so? Several things, it seems to me. One is that he was raised in a loving family, and more broadly, in a nurturing and supportive Mormon community in Ogden. And you see that I'm a slide behind in my notes. He was very close to his parents. His father managed the family business, which I will turn to shortly, and he had a happy and active childhood. He had many friends, with his youngest of 3 children and the only boy. Very secure, he had and has no status anxiety. He was a Boy Scout, and he was shy but well-liked and admired by his peers, ran track, and had perfect attendance in the polk drum, drum corps and was commandant of the Ogden High School ROTC. So he's a member of a very well-established Ogden family. Richard Ballantyne was one of his great-grandfathers, was captain of a Mormon company who led the ox and pedestrian trips from the Great Plains to the Intermountain Basin. And he was also, Ballantyne was a missionary in India and a founder of the Mormon Sunday schools. Another great-grandfather, John Scowcroft, arrived by train rather than on foot with the oxen, arriving later, and founded the highly successful company of dry goods and food wholesalers. John Scowcroft and his company were helped by the fact that Ogden was a hub for rail traffic throughout the West. The Transcontinental Railroad switched from the Union Pacific to the Central Pacific trains, or vice versa, very close to where the Golden Spike originally connected, the road being built going west and that going east. And you had to get off at Ogden to change trains. And a total of 7 railroads ultimately joined up in Ogden. You can't go anywhere without coming to Ogden, town leaders boasted. As a result, though, Ogden had a thriving crime scene with opium dens, brothels, and gambling. Al Capone reportedly said that Ogden was too rough a town for him. As an aside, Scowcroft had another prominent great-grandfather, Job Pingree, who led 2 companies by foot to the Great Salt Lake Basin and founded the Pingree National Bank. He too was highly successful, and also like Richard Ballantyne, was a polygamist and actually jailed for a short while after being arrested by U.S. Marshals. Inspired by reading a new book entitled West Point Today, Scowcroft, the young Scowcroft, set his sights on attending the U.S. Military Academy, where he did well, including managing the undefeated U.S. Army football teams in the mid-late 40s after a World War II shortened 3-year curriculum. It was a grueling and incredibly difficult time initially, and Scowcroft had to find inner strength and persevere. Not pushed hard academically, though. In his senior year, he played a lot of bridge in college, he told me. Upon graduating and receiving his diploma from one of his heroes, General Eisenhower, Scowcroft joined the Army Air Corps. A year and a half later, during a dogfight exercise, and you see him here, by the way. Use this one here. So there's Scowcroft. A year and a half later, during a dogfighting exercise over the skies of Manchester, New Hampshire, though, his F-51B Mustang crashed, and Scowcroft broke his back and spent almost 2 years in military hospitals. But he could have easily died or been paralyzed for life. No longer allowed to fly, he had to remake his career. Barely a month after the crash, he got more shocking news. His father died of a heart attack at the age of 57. Lying in hospital beds and thinking about his future, he decided he didn't want to be in the family business and instead wanted to study and ultimately contribute to national security policy. He decided to become an expert on European and Russian history, nuclear weapons and deterrence, conventional warfare, and government and law. He went on to graduate studies in international relations at Columbia, eventually earning his doctorate in 1967, attended the Armed Forces Staff College and National War College, and taught at West Point in the Air Force Academy. Besides his commitment to the study of U.S. national security, his intellectual qualities, and his burning motivation to contribute to national security policy were other personal factors to his effectiveness. His superior officers repeatedly remarked on his ability to keep growing as an officer. Indicatively, his efficiency ratings improved as his career progressed. He would have certainly earned his 4th star, too, as did Alexander Haig and Colin Powell, had he not retired, almost certainly unnecessarily, from the Air Force when he became National Security Advisor. Scowcroft was helped by having some important sponsors, to be sure. Herman Bookma, who was head of the Armed Forces training program during World War II, George Lincoln, Andrew Goodpaster, and Air Force General Richard Yudkin, among others. And Scowcroft was also in the Air Force at a time when it was rapidly expanding and was able to fit in as an expert on strategy. But he also impressed his superiors by his initiative and willingness to go the extra mile. He was a team player all the same, even if his decisions didn't ultimately go his way. His commanding officers repeatedly wrote in their efficiency reports that they didn't see him as having enough, and that this was at a pre-inflationary time when officers couldn't look at their own ratings. Now, of course, they can, and like a lot of things, you get these inflated records, just like academic letters for jobs. Besides this ambition, talent, and professionalism, and besides his lack of need to impress or dominate, another crucial part of Scowcroft's effectiveness is his sense of humor and emotional intelligence, although the term didn't come to use until the 1980s and 90s. He laughs easily, enjoys practical jokes, and is respectful of others. He got along well with Kissinger. In fact, he's probably one of the very few people Kissinger very much respects, and they worked together as equals, and they've been friends for 44 years. Although he and Dick Cheney fell out in 2001 and have remained estranged, when they were both in the Ford administration, Scowcroft's successor as White House military assistant called Scowcroft and Cheney the White House's two most loved men. Richard Haas, who was the head of the Middle East desk on the NSC under Bush 41 and is now president of the Council of National Foreign Relations, as you probably know, has commented that the Bush administration was the most collegial of any of the four in which he worked. Working there was actually fun, he said. It sounds bizarre, but it's by far the most enjoyable experience a lot of us had before or since in government. There was a lot of camaraderie and kidding around. It was very relaxed. And this is at a time when, of course, they're working ungodly hours and under all these pressure and deadlines. What further made Scowcroft extremely effective as a government official, chairman of presidential commissions, business consultant, and corporate board member is his multivocality, his ability to speak credibly to distinct audiences, to span policy subsystems, to converse with different knowledge communities. He is expert and experienced with respect to international relations and foreign policy, with respect to nuclear strategy and deterrence, with respect to intelligence, and with respect to international economics. One of his aides, Nick Rostow, describes Scowcroft as being his own international lawyer. This is to say that he can speak to policymakers and practitioners, military leaders and defense intellectuals, academics and area experts, and a more general population of secretaries, interns, students, and West Point and Air Force cadets, thanks to this distinct combination of talents, diverse interests, and areas of accomplishment, and his down-to-earth manner. So why is he a strategist, you might ask? For many readers, the label is counterintuitive, since he would be seem to be a far cry from a Sun Tzu or a Karl von Clausewitz. They see Brent Scowcroft as one of many advisors to two moderate Republican presidents, both of whom were voted out of office. Or they see him as a faceless bureaucrat. Several former policymakers I talked to didn't consider him to be much of a strategist at all, with one describing him as working between the 40-yard lines. Yet others who have worked closely with him, including German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, do regard him as a strategist. But Scowcroft kept the side of him well under wraps, if with a few exceptions. So he may be a well-known Washington insider, but around the country, not so much. Scowcroft, though, has provided small doses of his strategic vision in the 100 or so op-eds he's written over the past 4 decades, almost all of them during the Reagan, Clinton, and George W. Bush administration when he was out of office. And his strategic sense is also evident in A World Transformed with George Bush, which is actually one of the best memoirs and accounts of presidential administrations that I've read, and in America, the World with Zbigniew Brzezinski and David Ignatius. And incidentally, the number of Scowcroft's op-eds is, I did a count, thanks to a research assistant at the other Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, and it's just about the same, just slightly below Kissinger and Brzezinski, over the same amount of time. But over that period, Scowcroft was in office much longer, and so couldn't write these op-eds, where these others were in held office for actually quite relatively short periods. And he's also written, Scowcroft that is, a number of journal and magazine articles, contributed about a half dozen book chapters for edited volumes, and co-authored several commission reports. But he has not written his own global analyses at length, unlike a George Kennan, a Richard Nixon, Henry Kissinger, or Brzezinski. What he does do is keep his eye on the ball, on ultimate objectives. And because of his knowledge of international history and study of foreign affairs, he's able to see the pieces in play, appreciate their capabilities and likely trajectories, and proceed accordingly. This skill became amply manifest under Bush 41, with that administration's close attention to personnel, the interagency process, and the content of foreign policy itself, as with its carefully planned speeches to Poland and Hungary and careful orchestration of U.S.-Soviet policy. The implication then is that a crucial aspect of being a strategist is operational. One could be a superb strategist, whether it's a military planner, a conceptually minded historian, or a political consultant, but if he or she is advising from the sidelines, not being heeded, then that person can hardly be considered to be a strategist. Princeton's own George Kennan is a case in point. Kennan is rightly renowned for his influential long telegram in Mr. X article in Foreign Affairs, The Sources of Soviet Conduct, yet after this great burst of influence, policymakers essentially ignored him for the next 5 decades while he was at the Institute for Advanced Study and on his Pennsylvania farm. Scowcroft, in contrast, has been influential from the early 70s through the early 2010s, and this at the highest levels of government. No other policymaker over the last 40 years has been as influential for so long a period, a testament to Scowcroft's expertise and judgment and to the regard others have for him. Let me offer a few examples of Scowcroft's strategic thinking, that is, the ability to keep the big picture in mind and to work with the pieces in play to be operationally effective and to achieve results. So with the British pound collapsing in 1976, and with Secretary of State Kissinger and Treasury Secretary Simon at loggerheads, Scowcroft stepped in and quietly worked out an arrangement for a concession by Prime Minister Callahan's Labour government and for a $4 billion IMF rescue package backed by the United States and supported by Germany and France, and that's about $16 billion today. The key was, with the pound sinking on world markets, any further publicity would cause a risk on a run on the pound. All the negotiations had to be kept secret then, away from the press, and they were, which again bespeaks the trust others had in him, notwithstanding, though, the financial stakes, the political disagreements, and ideological disagreements between Callahan's Labour government and the free market economists in the U.S. Treasury Department. Another example is Scowcroft's advice to President Bush in early 1989 that the United States and the Soviet Union both withdraw their ground troops from Central Europe. His logic, Scowcroft's was that NATO minus the U.S. in comparison to the Warsaw Pact minus the USSR would be to the United States' net advantage and would take the initiative away from Mikhail Gorbachev. Although the idea provoked a firestorm in the administration, especially from Secretary Cheney, the president agreed to a scaled-back version of Scowcroft's idea. A third example of this strategic sense was the decision under Bush 41 to push for a radical reduction in the number of MIRVed warheads and the adoption of a single warhead ICBMs, a process called downloading in the nuclear weapons lexicon. Scowcroft's argument, and one that gradually prevailed, was that MIRVed rockets with up to 10 warheads were more attractive both as targets and as weapons to be used than were single warhead ICBMs. This, in fact, was the logic of reducing the number and lethality of strategic weapons than a few START and START-2. So, and these will be my last set of comments, why would a political scientist write a biography of a national security advisor? For one, it gives us leverage on the question of structure versus agency. How much do individual matter exactly? And here's one who clearly did make a difference. Learning of Scowcroft's family history, his Air Force career, his record as a presidential advisor, his role as a business consultant, and his influence as senior statesman informs us then about how he became so expert, so effective, and so secure a person psychologically, materially, and socially. As the elder Bush said when they were in office together, Scowcroft doesn't want anything. Yet it may be this very sense of security that made the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor when he was 13, the humiliating and dispiriting experiences of the U.S. Military Academy, and the 2 years in military hospitals following his fateful crash, that much more searing and ultimately more consequential. In other words, we can think of biography both as a case study of Scowcroft as an Air Force officer and a national security advisor, and an outcome study of the individual as a dependent variable. Another reason for this biography is that a study of his life informs us at present, given the implicit and sometimes explicit comparisons the biography makes with careers of other presidents and their foreign policy principles. One lesson is the importance of personnel and interpersonal chemistry in the White House. both between the President and his National Security Advisor, but also among other foreign policy principles. Scowcroft learned from the very difficult Nixon 40 years and from the Iran-Contra affair that the NSC had to coordinate policymaking and not conduct foreign operations, that the President and the principals had to be able to delegate responsibility, which accordingly had to be closely coordinated, and for this to happen, the different agencies and their principals had to buy into the President's decisions. What the failure in Vietnam made glaringly apparent was that U.S. presidents and their staffs had to work closely with Congress and the press if they were to lead effectively. This meant visits with members of Congress and reporters, individually and in groups. It meant public appearances. It meant orchestrating campaigns to pass legislation, sustain vetoes, approve nominees, and achieve other objectives. In fact, the Bush administration did quite well in foreign policy, considering that it had to work with the Democratic majorities in control of both houses, and a media and public tired of a third term of a Republican presidency. This may be why President Scowcroft is considered the best national security advisor to date from the mid-50s to the mid-2010s. So there's both this inter-organizational clarity and this interpersonal trust that allows this combination that allows the NSC, at least that under Bush and Scowcroft, to be so effective. A second lesson is the success of Scowcroft's indirect approach. One of his characteristic ways of diffusing problems is to think about how to undermine their causes so the problems themselves dissipate, rather than belligerently demand that the wall being torn down, for instance. Scowcroft, his NSC staff, Berlin Wall, and the administration worked to create the underlying conditions such that the Berlin Wall would fall of its own accord. In order to be able to take the initiative away from Gorbachev, Bush, Baker, and Scowcroft had to think through about where they wanted to go, figure out what they wanted to achieve militarily, strategically, and economically, and then provide the set of carrots and sticks that could induce the Soviets to agree, and which also, of course, meant getting the UK, Germany, and France on board. Or, to give another example, to make nuclear warfare unattractive as a military option for the US and Soviet officials both. The same applies to human rights. The cause of human rights would best be furthered by making the reasons for repression no longer obtain. That is, through the political and economic development and quiet diplomacy, rather than through exhortations and sanctions. The same principle would apply to terrorism, to address the conditions that make a particular view of Islam a less viable option and less attractive among Muslim populations. This is a probabilistic approach, then, making the ground more fertile for constructive policies and better lives, and less fertile for terrorism or the use of force and so forth. We can also learn from Scowcroft's enlightened realism, and he calls himself an enlightened realist. He accepts the world as it is, with its dictators and private police forces and rogue states, and believes the United States should work with existing powers in pursuit of common goals for the promotion of international stability. This means having open lines of communication with the Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, Arafat and the PLO, Iran, and other opposing governments and hostile states. Indeed, this has been a hallmark of his career, a combination of toughness, strong defense, walking softly and carrying a big stick, and being open to bilateral negotiations or multilateral agreements. Except that this nuanced view does not conform with the simplicities of American retail politics, as you see now, or the idealistic and reformist strands of U.S. internationalism. A final lesson is of government secrecy and accountability. When I asked the general about Edward Snowden's leaks, he was against Snowden's revelations, quote, with every fiber in his body. This was in accord with my expectations, consistent with his longtime support for executive privilege, presidential discretion, and strong U.S. intelligence capabilities. In the very next breath, though, he surprised me by saying that Snowden's leaks might have a salutary effect by starting a constructive debate among members of Congress, the press, and the public about legislative oversight, the quality and scale of U.S. operations, and democratic accountability. And by the way, both Snowden and the CIA torturers discussed in the Senate report earlier last year were contractors, a fact that has received little attention. Scowcroft's lesson would be that the recent U.S. actions, the use of torture, the too easy recourse to drones, domestic spying, detract from U.S. soft power and reduce the legitimacy of the United States government. When U.S. presidents cannot claim that the United States seeks to protect human rights and cannot point out to other countries of the United States example as a shining city on a hill. It is hard for U.S. leaders to lead the world and for the U.S. government to be trusted by its own citizens. There's a moral dimension to U.S. politics then that is now missing, but that was there during World War II, during the Cold War, and arguably in the First Gulf War. Such moral certitude did not spare presidents from having to make extremely tough decisions. Think of the Korean War, Hungary and Czechoslovakia, or the Helsinki Final Act. But the overall objective was nonetheless clear. As a result, the study of Scowcroft's life begs the question of U.S. grand strategy. What replaces the containment of the Soviet Union? What is the United States for? Is it just against terrorism, extremism, ISIS, or other group? What hope does the U.S. government and American society offer our children and grandchildren? What promise does it hold for other people of the world? Beyond material consumption, it's not very clear. The advantage of biography is that provides readers with a look at a full arc of someone's life. Here, someone who's been at the inner circles of policymaking for 5 decades and across 5 presidencies, and thus may induce us to think immortality of ultimate purposes and of meaning. The problem with such a fine-grained study of decision-making and policy formation at the highest levels, though, is that we don't have good systematic data. Since there may be only 1, 2, or a small handful of people making such decisions. What's worse, as one political scientist points out, is that biography, quote, provides no explicit conceptual framework for the selection, organization, and presentation of data. Worse still, Scowcroft often did business verbally without committing thoughts to paper and does not boast of his achievements and is reserved and guarded in his conversations. So I think John Lewis Gaddis has it right. Biography, to a large extent, is an exercise in imagination. The biographer tries to put on someone else's shoes, to try to envision being in and of his or her world. Fully capturing that vision is a fool's errand, to be sure. But by consulting with archives, by reading relevant histories, political science, journalism, biographies, memoirs, by consulting published or taped interviews or oral histories, by interviewing those connected to the subject if possible, it is surely also possible to be more accurate, more thorough, and fairer. And being fair not only means selecting the positive, as some biographers do, or dwelling on the negative, as others do, but describing, making intelligible, and interpreting the subject's action, thoughts, and own personal circumstances. This, then, is a study of power close up. One is, I submit, very much the realm of a political scientist. So thank you for your patience, and I look forward to your questions. Yes.
Thank you for your prepared remarks. 2 questions. You made a comment about laying the groundwork for actions to evolve or whatever. Specifically, they wouldn't beat their chest and say the wall's got to go down. It would create the conditions for its own decline. So in the context of Obama's remarks in the last 3-4 years, Assad must go. Would Scowcroft have promoted assertion like that, or would he just say, let's lay low and,
No, I mean, you never want to, count your chickens before they hatch, right? I mean, that kind of policy doesn't make much sense. No, he would very much lay low. He wouldn't really say anything. And you would work with allies, and you would figure out, well, what are we willing to tolerate about, use of chemical weapons or biological warfare, and you'd have to make some tough choices. And again, these things are very difficult. You have to coordinate with your allies. And I mean, what's been striking to me, and some of you may know as much or more, what's been striking to me is how little the other Middle Eastern states have been involved in all this. And I mean, that's I guess a banal point, but it's certainly that it's a much larger solution than the United States. And to think that the United States just remotely can change things in Syria, or can make a decree, and somehow that's going to happen. It won't. I will say, though, your question brings up something where I think he and the Bush administration did get criticized, is that for a long time their press relations and public affairs wasn't working very well, and they weren't very good at getting the message out and explaining things. And maybe this is in part the press, but again, you can work with the press. I spent some time with the press secretary for the Israeli Defense Forces, And he was explaining, and I've read accounts of this about sort of that fine line you have, and it really takes an exceptional person. But there are people out there who can both be credible and reliable to the members of the media, but also faithfully render what the administration is doing. And it's a tricky thing, but that's one thing where many people have told me that they thought the administration do very well. One person, Maureen Dowd, said that people like to hear a tune from the president, and want to hear a tune from the administration, and the Bush administration wasn't very good at carrying a tune for the people of what was going on in foreign policy. I mean, I was in grad school at the time that all this happened, at the 80s and late 80s and early 90s, and I just remember how shocking it was. And I'd look at headlines and read stories and keep up with stuff, but how quickly it happened and the lack of context for it, and I think part of that was a communication problem.
My second question, sorry to preempt anything, as we discussed before you talked, did you get into his mind at all about his advice to George W. Bush regarding going into Iraq and what the psychodynamics with the father and all this might have been?
Yeah, well, I did a little bit. I mean, he wouldn't talk about the psychodynamics, but it was very clear that I think the movie W has, you can take it or leave it, but there's what the movie has and what other accounts of the Bush presidency, the Bush 43, I think there certainly is a rivalry and a desire. More importantly, that I'm going to get reelected. I'm going to finish the job. I'm going to win the war and win it outright. And so there's this kind of it's kind of the son wants to succeed his father. So there's an element of that, and a lot of this I think is very understandable. So there was that rivalry, but what happened is that as soon as 9/11 happens, Scowcroft is talking to people, he's writing op-eds. I mean, at the time, he's serving as chairman of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. So he was kind of in the loop. I mean, it's a non-paid position, and they meet periodically, but he was in the loop. He's very close to Stephen Hadley. Condi Rice was one of his proteges. He knew a bunch of others, Cheney, of course. So people knew his position, but what happened, I think, was immensely frustrating for him, is he'd write op-eds, he'd go on TV, actually. People would talk about his position on television, and they were still kind of this train was still, or this ship, whatever to call it, this juggernaut was still proceeding. And it was just, I think, very, very frustrating. And finally, he went on TV with, I guess it's Meet the Press, with Bob Schieffer. I think that's it. And one of his aides, now deceased, Arnie Cantor, said, Brent, you should write that up and turn that into an op-ed. And so he wrote this up into an op-ed, and once it was accepted at the Wall Street Journal, he sent a copy to Condoleezza Rice. He also sent a copy to Bush 41, so they weren't surprised, and no one said anything, and then it came out, and then all hell broke loose. I mean, the Times and Time Magazine are writing that there's a schism in the Republican Party, and there's all this stuff as controversy, and then within a few weeks, this all blows over. But yeah, it was but Bush couldn't say anything to W, and he was too diffident to do so, and he was not his style. And George W. Bush said, well, his father was kind of this loser. He hasn't done what he should have done as president. Got reelected and win the war and be really commanding, and being called a wimp and allowing this to be kept being called a wimp. And so there was so Scowcroft, and he wasn't prompted by 41. He took this on his own, encouraged by his staff at his consulting firm, and they proceeded. Yes, people maybe identify themselves, yeah.
I'm Diana Negroponte from the Woodrow Wilson Institute in Washington, D.C. Thank you, Professor Sparrow, about writing about a man who is underestimated, and that you call him the greatest national security advisor gives me relief that he has outpaced Henry Kissinger, and that the prize you give to this man, Scowcroft. However, I don't think he's a strategist. He is a wise tactician who knows how to accomplish goals illegally. I really mean it in a low-key way. And so where I want you to focus is part of the tactical, is the recreation of the National Security Council system. Not a sexy subject, but a very important one, in which the deputies reach the major decisions and only the most difficult issues pass up to the boss.
No, I mean, I disagree with that, and I'll explain why I disagree with that. But certainly the tactician part, and I talked about very briefly, I talked about how getting the NSC process, and by that what you point out is a big part of that, is having these deputies committees and having them. One of the things that happens after that unsuccessful coup attempt is they start making the deputies committees the decision-making body, and it's only when they can't reach agreement. I mean, things will still go to the principals, Baker and Bush and Cheney, but it's only when they can't make agreement is that then they have to talk among themselves, and very rarely do things go to the president. So yes, I think this is something that's understudied, that's tremendously important. In fact, maybe one of you is going to ask these questions, but if people had to ask me, what would you ask for about a presidential candidate? I said, how are they as administrators? How do they organize? Who do they trust? How good are they at listening and finding out information, different kinds of information? How do they make decisions and deploy personnel? And something that is not very sexy, and as a campaigner, we think of them and they're their political advisors and so forth, but it's absolutely critical to how well a president can function. So yes, I agree with the importance of tactics, but about the strategy part, I mean, I think it's as a Cold War. I mean, that was the example I gave about the nuclear weapons and how you handle the short range and intermediate range nuclear weapons. The example of withdrawing conventional forces from the Central European theater, about figuring out figuring out about how the United States is going to proceed with China. I mean, you can say there's a lot of tactics there, but it's also strategy. And people have described it this way as thinking, not 5, not 10, but 20 years down the road, and thinking, well, what does the United States want? And so how do I get there? And so that strategy is kind of basically, I mean, we could disagree with this as a goal, is the primacy of the United States. And so you would say for the United States to really be the most effective, it needs the cooperation and buy-ins from other countries and international organizations. And to think it can lead or do things unilaterally, we just don't have the strength or political will of the American people or the resources to do that. So he would say that, he would argue that the world of U.S. leadership that is bending towards democracy and human rights, and that is democratic where it can be, but really geared to, as I said, is kind of this realpolitik too, geared to stability and being able to live with the devils you know rather than risk the demons that you don't. So there's a conservative element to that too, to be sure. Yes?
George Disichka, I live in Lawrence. So did George W. Bush lie to get us into Iraq in 2003, or was it just a very stupid mistake?
Well, it's the way I describe it is I think there's mixed motives. I think some people were genuine in wanting to have democracy in the Middle East and that Iraq was a hope. There's some people who knew that yes, this is flimsy evidence. We're kind of spinning things and making the best case possible. We want to get to a certain place, war with Iraq, and we'll do. I mean, they're talking about war in Iraq. It was already policy on the shelf when they first get into office, and they're really looking for a peg for that policy.
But is it in the interest of our country? And are these people that were genuine about it, are they patriotic?
Well, I think they're all maybe patriotic in different ways, right? But it's I would say that not patriotic in terms of caring for American blood and treasure, but patriotic maybe in a very, I would say, a narrower view of the United States. That is the people who are pushing for war.
Right.
Yeah.
Not profiteers?
Well, I think there's profiteers and helping American business, right? I mean, I think there's an element of that. And
that's not patriotic.
No, it's patriotic in a narrow sense. If you think America depends...
It's greedy.
What?
It's greedy.
Well, I think there's also people, and there's a strand of Scowcroft that agrees with this, and a lot of people, is that for the U.S. leadership, we talked about its primacy, depends on leadership and primacy in the arms business, and that's part of the United States. And that's partly greed, and it's also part of the U.S. and being able to project its forces and make the world in its image, in what it wants. Yeah, for the most part, I think it's, and certainly by the decision leaders, I think there's mostly cynicism. Yeah. I mean, look, I discussed that at length, and you look at the evidence, and it's grim.
Those retired bums should come see the exhibit out here in the hallway.
I'm sorry?
The retired bums from the Bush administration should see the artwork, which is out here.
Yeah, thanks.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm Fred Greenstein. I'm an emeritus professor of
Yes, I know your work, yes.
Thank you. I wonder how you would, whether you've given some thought to how Scowcroft's management of the national security process compares with other national security advisors from the Eisenhower period on, and by extension, what makes for a good performance.
Yeah, a couple things. I mean, one is that the role of the national security advisor really depends on the president and how the president and whoever he's closest to decides they want to organize their administration. So for some people, as you know, sort of Cutler was nominally national security advisor under Eisenhower, but then there's Goodpaster, and Goodpaster's doing a lot of things himself. And there's also, I think, a couple other national security advisors during the Eisenhower administration. There's also Colin Powell, also Condoleezza Rice, by and large. There are other national security advisors who see themselves as really kind of just as the intermediaries and facilitators, so kind of the coordinators. So they're not really having independent input on policy, but rather they are making sure that everyone is on the same page, so to speak. Now, one of the things that Scowcroft insists on is that he's equal in influence to James Baker or to Richard Cheney, and that was something that you sort of saw that with McGeorge Bundy, that sort of that high elevated status, but you don't have that with pretty much everybody with the Reagan administration. You certainly do have that with Kissinger and with Brzezinski, but you don't have it with others. But the thing with Kissinger and why he isn't so successful is that a lot of people distrusted him, and he would he'd speak out of both sides of his mouth. And I mean, he's brilliant, he's charismatic. I mean, I have a long bit about this because their relationship is very close. They're still friends, and it evolves actually. There are times when I've interviewed. I did about 41 interviews with Scowcroft, and earlier on, there are occasions where he really didn't say nice things about Kissinger, and then later on he says nice things about Kissinger. So maybe that was just his mood. So he's a very complex guy. But one of the things he does, at least his when he was with Nixon and Ford, is that he concentrates power. He's not very good at sharing information. He's not very good at transparency and including others in decision making. He's playing all these games with the press and leaking information and so forth. And so he's really he really does makes the government really break down. And so that's why you get a lot of the domestic spying, like with the what was his face, Yeoman, in the Nixon administration, when you have folks taking things from Kissinger's burn bag and taking them to Admiral Moore, who's chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And so you have this. So he's still probably the most well known, the most famous national security advisor, and arguably, well, not arguably, but no, he and Nixon were very close in terms, and then Bush and Scowcroft were, but of course the Nixon years have the opening to China and have the Hanoi peace agreements and other things, so they receive a little more attention.
Somebody said that the reason why Nixon he taped the Oval was because he heard that Kissinger was saying all these bad things about Georgetown and the sign he set. He taped this whole reason why I had the tapes.
Yeah, he wanted to keep track of people, but he also wanted to have a record, and he thought that records would exonerate him, or not that he was feeling guilty about things necessarily, but that they would reflect well on him. And so he so he wanted to set up this system. And when I just finished reading Woodward's book with Alexander Butterfield about this, setting up the taping system, it's really quite fascinating. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I'm Travis Sharp. I'm a PhD student here in the Woodrow Wilson School. So as you were writing your book, John Meacham was writing his biography of George H.W. Bush,
Yeah.
which relied on all the personal diaries that George H.W. Bush kept through long periods of his life. So two questions related to that. First is, his book beat you by about 6 to 8 months, but presumably before you went to press. So did you have to change anything in your book based on what came out in Meacham's book?
No, his book, my book was in January 2015.
Oh, so you beat him.
I beat him.
I see. Okay.
But he was already, I think, in press when he was doing it. So he doesn't, I have a copy of it, and I haven't cracked it yet. I did look through the index to see if, you look at the Scowcroft stuff, but so he's afterwards, and so they're basically coincidental.
Yeah, but it's interesting because his argument about George H.W. Bush is actually, it's related to yours. I mean, he makes an argument that he's just a decent man, right? So it's his personal traits, and it didn't always lead to success, but when he was successful, it can be explained in part by his personal decency. So what's the deal with this administration? You just have this convergence of decency? I mean, how do you explain, is this just like a one-time thing? I mean, maybe it's only the two of them, but...
Well, this is one of the things where I think, when I've read some reviews of Meacham's book, is he doesn't stress enough Bush's intelligence work and the fact that he knows people in other countries so well from his time with the UN, of course, he was chairman of the Republican National Committee, from being China liaison, in the mid 70s, and that there's this strategic sense that he has, and because of his time of World War II and the Greatest Generation, he's aware of kind of the U.S. power in a way that I think is more subtle. I mean, he wasn't very good verbally, but I think he's Phi Beta Kappa at Yale. I mean, he's clearly very, very smart, but when you heard him on television or on the radio or how the press portrayed him, that doesn't come across very well. But I think a lot of things, so I think there's this decency, but also this very quiet expertise, and certainly they weren't, opposed to, maybe you don't want to call it unethical, but they weren't opposed to covert actions and different other and misinformation and so forth, if that was for the greater good. So that was not above playing games. So yeah, that's how I would amend it.
Okay, well, thank you very much for coming. And we do have your book sale outside.
Thank you.